Hey everybody. Kim can't be here today, so I'll be running the meeting today. Welcome everyone. I guess we'll give folks a few more minutes to trickle in. As always, if you could edit the community meeting notes, and we invite you to add yourself. I'll paste it in the chat for easy reference. And if anyone was the one who added actually I should probably just look into the doc history, but number 20 or number 276 to the agenda, it would be great if you could add your name so we know who would lead that conversation. All right, looks like people aren't trickling in at this point. So hi everyone, welcome to another SLSA biweekly meeting. A couple administrative things to take care of quickly. One, several steering committee members can't make this time slot, and so we'd like to consider moving it to Thursdays, but on the opposite week. So the next meeting would be March 17th, as opposed to what's 2 weeks from now? The 9th. And it would be at the same time slot, 9 to 10 a.m. Pacific. We asked if you can't make the new meeting, if you could fill out that Google form so that way we know. We will plan, like the default decision is that we will move the meeting to that time slot. But if there's a significant number of people who can't make it, then we'll not do that. And we'll send out, either way, we'll send out an announcement over the SLSA Discuss mailing list, and we'll update the calendar on the shared calendar on the website, and in a Google Doc. So hopefully everyone should know. But again, please fill out that form. That the link is in the meeting notes. I had two related. First of all, I guess any comments on that? Okay, if you do, just feel free to jump in. Another kind of administrative item. In the past, we had talked about switching to community specification. I think we're going to, someone volunteered to actually start doing that. I don't know if you have any preferences on that, like if we just use a single repo or have a separate community repo, please comment on that issue. Otherwise, we're just and doing that. And similarly, there's issue 296, which is the, actually I should present my screen, sorry. I'm so used to Kim running this that I am not doing as good a job as she does.
You're doing great, thank you. Oops.
Oh, Mark, if you're talking, you're on mute.
Mark, you're on mute. Uh-oh. I still can't hear you, Mark. Oh no. And it was working a moment ago.
I hate
Hey,
Zoom.
there it is.
I really hate Zoom. When you do the screen share, it mutes you with no option to unmute. The unmute button turns grayed out. Does anyone know how you could both talk and share at the same time?
I know it's possible. I've done it many times.
I have never seen that.
I have never heard of that problem because I present with presentations all the time on a shared screen. So I know
Okay.
it's possible.
Well, it's
All right.
working now.
So is it sharing now? Okay. There's just no indication that it's working. If you share a tab, it mutes you. If you share a window, it doesn't. I don't know.
Oh,
Okay, sorry about that. So anyway, if you have any opinions there, please add them. Happy to discuss now, but that might not be the best use of time since we have several other items in the agenda. If anyone wants to speak up, feel free to do so now. Okay, also happy to hear comments in there. The first item on the list was issue number 20, adding rationale and examples to all the requirements. I don't know, did anyone add this to the agenda? Or does anyone know why it's here or what specifically we intend to discuss?
Asking what the rationale is to talk about rationales.
okay.
Yeah.
That's me. My
Okay.
fault. Sorry. Yeah. So basically, for each, there are several SLSA criteria. I actually didn't I link to an issue that gave an example? Yeah, number 20. Didn't that? Yeah, add a rationale and examples for every requirement. So this is based on my experience, not just with the best practices badge, but really over decades of working with other organizations that create, best practices lists. Is don't just tell me what you should do. Tell me why that's important. What's the attack you're trying to counter? So, for example, it says, "Hey, have a scripted build." Why? I chose that one because if we can't give a rationale for that one, we're in trouble. Uh, but basically, what is the problem that you are trying to counter? What would be the bad thing that happened if you didn't do this? And if nothing else, for example, if it turns out that there's a situation where the rationale is wrong, then that suggests that maybe this is needs to be fixed, or maybe you need to declare that not applicable or something. But something for each of the requirements. One issue, of course, is where to stick it. One easy way would be just using HTML's details tags. But however we want to do this, I think it'd be important to include a rationale for each, and we can do this over time. This is not something you have to do instantaneously. Pick one thing to give a rationale for, write that, add it, repeat over time. But first step is agreement that we ought to record rationales.
Yeah, I agree with that. I also agree with using the simple HTML for that. On the threats page, salsa.dev/threats, that's what I use there, of just the summary details, and then use CSS to format as a table. So if anyone likes doing that sort of stuff with web development and CSS and stuff, I would certainly welcome having someone figure out a better way to format it. It would also, I think, if we were able to do that, would better format it on mobile. Because if you ever tried to read the requirements on your phone, it's like some super wide table and hard to read. So I think if anyone has opinions on how we could restructure that to include details and show hide stuff, would be great.
How's this? I can volunteer to at least that first text of the rationale. I would like somebody else who is more patient with CSS to to fix the CSS if it's necessary. I mean, if it there's existing it may be that the existing stuff is good enough, but if not, I think it'd be good to fix. It's also easier to fix once you have some text to look at. Oh, this is what it would look like. So, and as I said, I think this is the sort of thing that once you add one and it looks okay, we can iterate through. I think for the most part, we shouldn't have problems giving rationale. But my experience has been as you add the rationale, you suddenly, oh, I didn't word this quite right. And that's so even if nobody reads the rationale, just the process of making it usually forces you to be more precise about what you say, if that makes any sense. It refines more carefully what you meant. Okay, so all right, I will self-assign some making at least a first stab using that rationale probably as a starting point. And Mark, I will probably need to chat with you about exactly where to stick this in the HTML so that we don't. The goal is to work together and not screw things up.
Yep. I think so. We could also link to the threat model too and expand that wherever needed.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
Derek said in the chat, is the goal to map that to something like a NIST control or a threat model framework or just generic descriptions?
My goal was just generic descriptions. If we want to include, oh, whoops, there's some strange text. If we want to mention the rationales also, that linking to something else is fine, but I actually don't agree that linking to, say, NIST is enough of a rationale. It would be part of a rationale, but saying you must comply with Control 5 because you must comply with Control 5 is usually a disaster. That just means that you've moved the question, you haven't answered the question.
Hey, David, I'd be
Yes.
interested in helping to collaborate on that with you. I'm coming in newer to salsa, so maybe I could be your layman to consume some of this and work on it.
Okay. I'm not envisioning something super complex. I think the idea is, and Mark, we can talk about where to do this, but basically make a pull request in the HTML. The first version people will hate for some reason or other, and then we'll fix either its location or the text, and we'll just beat on it. And but yes, that'd be fantastic. So, Aaron, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your last name.
Baki.
Baki. Okay.
Yeah, and I'll
right.
be your hater. Sounds good.
All right. Hopefully the loyal opposition. Okay. So I will try to create a very first cut. Mark will beat it. Aaron will beat it. Other folks are obviously welcome. But yeah, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
And David, I was going to add that I can find either myself or someone on Ghost to help with the HTML CSS kind of beautification problem. So,
you are a wonderful person. Who is that? Brian Russell? Excellent.
Yes, this is Brian from Google.
Okay.
And I just add a note in the doc, putting that in there too.
Beautification. All right. I like that word. Excellent. All right. Thank you.
Did you add the next one too, David?
Let's see here. This is the scope of salsa discussion.
Or did anyone else add
adding this one? This was I may have, but it links to actually something posted by Mark. How does salsa fit into the broader supply chain?
Maybe I added it. I don't even remember. 2 weeks ago was a long time ago. So sure, add my name. Yeah, I think I'd like to consider like whether if anyone has opinions on how best to consider salsa in the broader supply chain security right now, SLSA is focused entirely on integrity, meaning protection against tampering, both at the source level and binary level. For most users, that's probably not the biggest concern. We talked about this in previous biweekly meetings. I think there's not, within Google, I talked to some other folks about this, and it seems like there's at least a reasonable argument that you could expand SLSA, at least the brand, to consider more than just integrity. Like particularly vulnerability management is one of the biggest things that users face, and also provenance and declaring dependencies is very related to SBOM and vulnerability management. And so there's probably a good opportunity to have a story that kind of solves user needs bigger. So I think it's worth coming up with a proposal. I think we could use the proposal framework that we mentioned earlier to at least write up the idea, and then we could discuss it kind of more broadly. Michael?
Oh yeah, I just wanted to add on that was something that was actually recently discussed right before we released the CNCF reference architecture for public comment. One of the things was that SLSA does fit the provenance piece that has been missing, right? Like there's a lot of things that are out there, whether it's security scanning tools and network, security tools, all that sort of stuff that can help in lots of different areas. But one of the things that has been missing, which is what I think SLSA really, really hits, is the piece specifically around provenance. And like, how can I trust, or how can I have an increased level of trust around that the scans that I'm running are against the thing that I built, and the thing that I built did come from the software, did come from the code that I pulled down, that sort of thing.
Yeah. So if anyone is interested in collaborating to write up a proposal, at least to me personally, it's not a slam dunk. I'm concerned around scope creep and making it less focused and kind of adding more confusion. So I'd like to see some sort of more clear proposal weighing the pros and cons, and like how we could communicate this and incorporate the broader supply chain security in a way that doesn't cause us to lose focus. Jonathan?
Yeah, one thing that I've been thinking about is really looking at it from a user's perspective. Whether it's some sort of enterprise or firm, and how they would look at procuring their supply chain using SLSA or using other products, and trying to figure out, is that something we could work on, and try to identify what those use cases are or those requirements are, and then try and figure out how that maps to the gaps perhaps in SLSA. And then ultimately take that as user requirements, and then highlight, well, you know what, that's not appropriate for SLSA, we'll leave it, or we'll put it somewhere else, but at least we know what people are actually looking at or trying to solve. So happy to help with either one of those things, Mark.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. Sarah?
Hi, this is Sarah Evans with Dell. This is my first meeting with SLSA, and that was the very question I had. That I'm like, this SLSA is great. How does it fit into the bigger ecosystem? Because with security, automation, and orchestration, you have individual components that exist in a silo, and understanding how they integrate into the whole is the big picture of security that I think that everyone's looking for. So I'm happy to contribute to what is the role of SLSA so that it doesn't have scope creep, but then also how does it fit into the broader ecosystem? And I'm excited to engage.
Great, thanks. Sorry, there's something in the chat. Okay, well, if there's, we could continue. I'll reach out to those folks who mentioned it, and again, comment on the thread if you're interested in that topic as well. I think the next topic is Mike on the SSF demo.
Okay, yeah. So I've been giving a lot of demos recently on this, so I don't remember exactly to what extent folks might have or might not have seen stuff. So I'm just gonna show off some of this stuff, and as sort of announced in the supply chain integrity working group. We are going to be contributing this to the OpenSSF, and wanted to kind of just give a highlight and how it sort of integrates with SLSA, how the different pieces come together. So just give me 1 second. Second here. Share my screen. Can you see the diagram that's up? Cool.
Yep.
Yeah, we do.
All right, cool. So so a lot of this comes from the CNCF's supply chain reference architecture. We have, our team sort of has built out a an implementation of that reference architecture, and we are contributing it to the OpenSSF, which should hopefully come through in the next few weeks. And just kind of wanted to, I know I showed a couple of demos of a few of the different pieces working, but wanted to kind of show a high level architecture, maybe one quick example, and just, show how we're sort of integrating some of the SLSA pieces, and then where we also see maybe some needs, or not needs, but some future work that we would like to sort of participate in with SLSA, and, maybe some, gaps we're seeing there. So once again, the Secure Software Factory is more or less just, you can think of it as just a CI/CD system that has some additional stuff baked on top of it, right? So some security, tooling, some policy, et cetera, et cetera. And so one of the things here, right, is so the Secure Software Factory is just a CI/CD system with some additional stuff baked on top. And so that could be stuff like, policy and whatever else. And so, you imagine, your CI/CD system, your Secure Software Factory pulls code from, various things, pulls dependencies from the outside world, whatever, pushes those things to artifact storage, and, gets used in production environments. You have a production emission controller, so on. I'm going to quickly kind of go over some of this, and let me just make this really large here. So this is sort of what the architecture looks like here. So the idea, right, is, and I'm just going to go quickly around in a circle here, right? You're providing identities to the various systems inside of, this is running inside of Kubernetes, but you're essentially providing identities to all the different pieces of the puzzle. You have a pipeline observer. So this is, in this case, Tecton chains for our implementation, but you imagine you need to have something that sort of records what the builds are doing and signs off on them. And so that's what Tecton chains is doing. And so Tecton chains is generating SLSA attestations based off of what it's seeing in Tecton. And not 100% fully integrated yet, but using stuff like Spiffy Spire, we can actually begin to attest to that the Tecton builds are happening on the right nodes. So we begin to get stuff like non-falsifiability and that sort of stuff. And the same thing for workloads themselves. Like, am I actually running the workload that I think I'm running, right? That's where some of that sort of stuff comes into play. All of this sort of stuff gets stored in metadata storage, whether it's OCI or a public transparency log or another database. We also use sort of admission controllers for what's actually happening inside the build system itself. So, if I go and try and run a build and I'm not using a base level container or the right sorts of if I'm not using, let's say, a base level container that's signed off by our team, then it's just not going to let it run, right? So that's trying to sort of block those sorts of pieces and fit into some of the sort of eventually start to flow into sort of either a summary salsa or a recursive or transitive salsa setup. We're also looking at sort of runtime. Well, the pipeline framework here is just sort of like we're using Tecton. And then we're trying to also do stuff with runtime visibility, right? Where, this is some longer term stuff. This could be sort of, Falco, it could be some of the Aqua security stuff, it could be Witness, it could be a lot of different things. But the idea of like sort of tracing what's actually happening in the builds so that if I do detect something, hey, what's actually going on, can detect sort of anomalous behavior. So even if we're following salsa best practices around stuff like hermetic builds and ephemeral builds and isolated builds, if I still see, hey, I'm running an isolated build, but that build is, it doesn't have network access, but it's trying to reach out to malware.com, I still want to know about that. And so largely, this is sort of a very basic sort of example here. And this is sort of what you would imagine, each of these is itself like a salsa attestation. So the pipeline observer, as each of these individual tasks run, like I'm fetching the code and dependencies, I'm recording that information, pushing it to metadata storage. And the same thing with stuff like pre-build tasks. So this could be security linting, that sort of thing. When I'm running a build, I'm doing the same sort of thing there, and so on. Okay. And then one of the things that we're doing, right, in order to kind of help us manage all of this, to sort of enforce that, yes, everything needs to have salsa attestations and needs to comply to certain levels of policy, we are using QLang as a configuration management language to help us manage stuff like, hey, when running builds, right, at a high level, we might enforce something like, you must have this sort of security scan, you must follow these sorts of tasks. And we want to make sure that, developers have some level to sort of tweak as they need. But if somebody is enforcing a security policy, you don't get to work around that security policy. And that's been a big concern, is that it's still very easy to kind of just, figure out a way to sort of change something in a task and push that out. QLang sort of says, no, developers won't have access to the actual underlying scripts. They just might have access to, their Maven, their Go configs and those sorts of things, but not have access to sort of swap out what version of Go with something else that is sort of unchecked. And then this sort of thing allows us to sort of deploy all of that out quite easily, all as one package. So one sort of Q set of definitions, we can have a very simple interface into it for end users. And that sort of deploys out stuff like stuff into chains. This could be, resources and configurations for chains, pipelines. We're using Kyverno, but this could be, OPA Gatekeeper and other things, as well as other resources like config map, secrets, and so on. Any questions so far?
I have just kind of a broader question. There's a number of tools that really want you to do, curl pipe to shell. And I was curious how you deal with that kind of circumstance.
Yeah. So
build suites.
Yeah. So I think the thing here, and so I don't want to go too deep into the weeds on all the specifics, but if I go back to, let's say, this diagram, this one, right, is, so ideally, anything that, let's say, is doing something like that, you would sort of limit the scope of that as much as humanly possible. So if you were to, if you are required 100% and there's no way to work around a curl pipe SH, maybe you just have, okay, I have a single task that is purely around that curl pipe SH. And, you need to enforce certain things like, hey, that curl pipe sh should be pushing it to some sort of cache or some sort of build storage, right? And so we can sandbox it as much as is possible so that we're only allowing it access to absolutely what it needs and nothing else. So if it does try to do something weird, we can detect it, right? And that plus some of the runtime visibility pieces, I think, help out. But as much as is possible, we're also trying to push back against that sort of pattern of doing things. But I think we also recognize that inevitably you're going to have like, yeah, okay, here's the one area where we do it. We don't think it's a big deal. Okay, great. We're going to isolate it and you know, make sure that the blast radius of it, if it does try to do something bad, we could easily detect it and prevent anything from sort of happening there.
But in your figure, that's basically the top left within the box fetch code dependencies task, and I guess you would hope that would actually be subdivided further. So for that part, is that's what you're thinking, right?
Yep. And you know, this is something that have implemented in a previous life where all dependencies were fetched before the actual build happened and in a completely separate sort of security context. So that, hey, you can download the dependencies. It could only write to this build storage and everything else for all those dependencies and yada, yada. But then once the build happened, the build couldn't actually go out, get network access, do that other stuff. Jacques, you're the first.
Yeah. I wanted to riff on top of what you said. In a previous life, when I was using my favorite tool, Concourse, it had an explicit distinction between resources, which are essentially things that you get from a network or send to a network, and tasks, which could, in theory, access a network, but it was bad form to do so. So yes, you would have your curl in a resource. So it was isolated. That concept didn't fully make its way into Tecton, but that's another story. The other thing I'd add in this riffing is something that's been kicked around in Sigstore land is this idea of an sget utility. Essentially, it behaves like a curl, it retrieves something, but it also relies on the transparency log to say, have I seen this before and is it trustworthy? So that you have additional guarantees. So that's a distinct sort of like security control, like on a different axis from making sure that you have the asset before you do anything with it in a different security context, as Michael said. But it adds an additional protection against the loss of integrity in the remote asset before it's retrieved.
Yep. And quickly on that point, yeah, what we're doing here on that end is we are actually doing that for the secure software factory itself. The code itself is going through, we're using sget and we're vendoring those tools and we're sort of enforcing like that, where possible, right? We're also doing stuff like we're enforcing hashes. So if we know, hey, these are good hashes, hey, we're a little bit more inclined to allow certain things, let's say through, but if we don't detect that those hashes line up or the signatures line up or whatever, we'll still block it on another area. Sean?
Yeah, I was just wondering whether you have, for those use cases, whether you have specific mechanisms for defining egress controls. Because so far we've only found, I think I've spoken about this before, the only thing we've found where we can't completely isolate our containers from the network has been authenticode signing, where we need to go and get a real-time timestamp. But everything else we've been able to firewall off. So what we're actually doing is we're saying, okay, well, here's a node in our cluster which has containers which have specific egress controls allowing just out to the timestamp server. Do you have any kind of larger framework for doing that sort of thing on a per component basis?
Yeah, so one of the things, that's kind of where I think the Spiffy Spire piece comes in. So a lot of the ways that people are starting to do it now is, so you would get, you would sort of mount the Spiffy Spire socket in the container, and it would be able to kind of get that from there. And that's kind of, because it's like you're just giving it the socket, you're not giving it like actual access to, the internet. Depending on who you talk to, that could be hermetic, it might not be. I think some of those conversations are going to be really interesting as we as a sort of a community begin to all generally get much better at this. I think some of those questions on like, hey, can we trust that socket? Can we trust accessing that time server? But I think the thing there is, yeah, where like the big thing from the build perspective, like my opinion is, yeah, if you can restrict it and you can, materially restrict it and use runtime visibility to actually monitor and verify that, I think you can kind of get a pretty good, I would feel a lot more comfortable to say, yep, it's only hitting this service, it's not hitting something else. Vicky? Oh, did Vicky drop their hand? Okay.
Yeah, hey, no, sorry. I dropped my hand, but didn't unmute.
Oh.
Technology is hard. So, hey there, everyone. This is VM Versor at Wipro. So you say it goes out and it grabs dependencies and keeps them in your artifact repository, and that's awesome. But does it do anything special, for instance, for containers? Should it have to go out to, for, let's say, Docker Hub or something like that? Can it unpack that container and inspect it and see what's going on? And, does it rebuild the container? How does it container, I guess?
Yeah,
Because that's a special case that a number of companies I've worked with have really found concerning, and it's not simply the individual NPMs and PyPIs and things like that of the world, right? The containers are a major concern as far as security and compliance and things like that.
Yeah, so we're trying to take the sort of similar to sort of the like how SLSA, right, is trying to establish the provenance piece. So the idea here is we would use either in the pre-build or post-build tasks some scanning tool, some whatever tool that would do that. But the idea is by sort of still keeping it in this factory, right, and keeping it within the constraints of this factory and the policies and whatever, we would say, okay, great, I have confidence that that this container I just built or this container I unpacked is the container I thinking that I wanted to unpack or that I wanted to scan, that I wanted to build. So in this case, like we're not making much of a decision there. Like, obviously for examples and demos purposes, we'll probably include some various open source scanning tools and show that we can sort of track, yes, you downloaded your source code and dependencies. Now you're running, let's say, some scanning against those dependencies, or you're validating attestations already, right? Maybe from a policy perspective, you've already, you have a separate, process to download, container images and sign off on them for them to be available to this secure software factory. That's another sort of model here. And we're trying to be relatively general and flexible, not saying that, there could be multiple approaches to the problem, but generally we're trying to say, hey, look, our tool itself is the primary goal is to sort of track the different tasks as they're happening and say that, the first thing that happened was fetching code and dependencies, and it handed it off to the pre-build tasks. And, we're able to see that, via an audit or whatever, see that, yes, the code and dependencies we downloaded is what ended up in the pre-build tasks. And after that, what ended up in the build artifact task, and so on and so forth. And then if some of that is stuff like unpacking of images and scanning and whatnot, yeah, like that would be more of like a runtime decision, or not runtime decision, an operational sort of decision of, hey, I'm allowing these sorts of scanning tools, these sorts of unpacking tools to run inside of the pipeline. And from a policy perspective, you might even say, I'm enforcing it. Like nobody can actually deploy a job that doesn't include that scanning task, something like that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Cool. Okay. So let me quickly, if I do, I don't want to take up too much more time. I can show a very quick example if folks want, but if there's something else on the agenda, I don't want to take up too much more time. Okay, no objections, I guess. So I'll share my screen here real quickly. And let me just go through and clear from the last demo I just gave on this a little while ago. So this is just a very simple build packs example. This could, this could be anything. It doesn't have to be build packs. It could be, it could be a Java pipeline. It doesn't even need to necessarily create a Docker image, but just to kind of show you what that Docker image is. Right. So this is a TTL image. So this is TTL is just it's a public open sort of service that deletes images every few hours so that you could use it for demo purposes. So I don't have to pollute like an actual public sort of Docker repository or anything like that. So this is just tailing, it's building the image. This is the sort of log here. If I go in here, it usually takes a few seconds for Tecton chains to sort of sign it and then push out that signature. Usually like 15, 20 seconds here. Okay, there we go. It's now signed. Now just to kind of show you what that looks like using Crane, right? Which, hey, this is the actual image, the latest here. But what like these attestations are sort of hash identified, right? So if I do Crane digest, right, you'll see, oh, this hash refers to these hashes for these attestations, right? And now if I want to go in and verify, hey, has the image been signed? Yes, it has been. Does it have an accurate SLSA attestation? Yes. And if we want to actually look what's in that SLSA attestation, I can run cosign again here. And it's pretty much saying, hey, was it signed with this key? This is for the basic stuff. Obviously, like if you were using this yourself, you have a vault or you'd use Spiffy Spire, that kind of thing. But if I go in here, you can see, it's an in toto statement. It is the SLSA provenance predicate type. The subject here is that image, right? And that image has this digest. And then we can look at, how did it run, right? Here's what that sort of script actually looked like when it was running the build. What were the arguments? And what was the sort of upstream image, and some other information. What were arguments to this sort of creator script, and so on. And so this is just one example here, and I don't have time to show the sort of more full-fledged one, but we can, one of the things is, hey, we can sort of string together a lot of these things. So if you did have a job that included a linting, like a security linting step, and after it's built, some scanning steps, you'd be able to go and say, okay, well, let me pull down all these attestations, make sure that all the various hashes line up, so that that yes, the output of one thing led to the input of another. And based on all that sort of thing, you can kind of say, okay, great, I now have an attestation that I got scanned. I have an attestation that I got built a certain way. I have attestations on all these different things. And that plus the runtime visibility and whatever else makes me feel comfortable that this artifact, doesn't have, is able to sort of mitigate at least some set of the of supply chain attacks.
I think I know the answer, but I feel I should ask. You include a lot of metadata here, including things like build dates and so on. Obviously, for some of these things, one countermeasure for some attacks is reproducible builds.
Yep.
But this is data about a particular build. It's not being embedded into the executables and so on. So it's fine to reproduce builds multiple times and say, hey, it keeps giving me the same answer, even though these are different builds and I'm obviously running them typically on different build times. Correct?
Yeah, correct. So in this case, like if you wanted to verify that the hashes lined up, you would just say, okay, pull down both of these in toto statements, and does the digests, do they have the same answer?
Okay, that's what I expected. Excellent.
Yep.
I just wanted to make sure that I was getting it.
Yep. And I don't have the example all sort of configured for the latest one, but I do have an example using Nix where I can create a container using Nix. And that container using Nix will always have the same digest. So when I generate this sort of thing, yes, this data should more or less be identical, besides maybe a couple of flags just to show that, hey, I'm running it on different systems, and to show that, hey, I'm running on different systems, but they're still, converging to the same hash. And then, the metadata might still be different. And, you might have some unique identifier, right? Just to kind of say, yes, you might have a unique identifier just to kind of relate it back to, did this actually run on 2 different build nodes? Because if it ran on the same build node, there's obviously attack vectors just to kind of say, oh, well, that node has been compromised, and it will just always tell you it's the same hash each time. Cool. So that's really about it. Just wanted to kind of give you an overview there. Talk about how we do plan to sort of integrate obviously a lot more SLSA stuff. Looking at maybe areas where, hey, this doesn't make sense for it to be a SLSA predicate. Maybe it makes sense for it to be its own custom predicate, and we should start to sort of see how sort of SLSA and in toto starts to sort of interact with some of these other groups that and what their predicate formats might look like.
Yeah, and I think in a few cases, I think some of these SLSA text I think could be refined, and so I'm hoping that the interactions back and forth will make sure the language is what, in fact, what was intended.
Yep. So that's all I have, unless there's any other questions.
Thanks a lot, Michael. I think the last item on the list, I think someone from Red Hat posted this, I believe, number 235, project maintainer package versus distribution package. I don't know who added it, if anyone wants to jump in.
Bill, was that you or Eric?
No, it was not. I'm looking at it right now.
I didn't add it, but I mean, I had some thoughts that are sort of related to it. And it kind of covers or goes with the conversation we had before the demo and even parts of the demo. It was, I look at SLSA as sort of it's a stamp on a pipeline that builds a product. And, the customers look at the product. And so we can hand them a product and say, this was built on a pipeline that is at this SLSA level. The problem is there's a whole lot of things we pull in from upstream. And, even if I can verify, an image that I pulled in and do a hash on it, I don't necessarily know, what pipeline did they use? How do they secure their pipeline? Are they at a certain SLSA level? So it ties into sort of the transitive property of SLSA. I'm not sure what my actual question is, just not sure how to address it, I guess, because I want to hand a product to a customer and say, you can be assured that this has gone through this process or this level of security, but I can only assure that for my pipeline. I can't necessarily point back to, the source of everything I ever use within my pipeline to build the ultimate product that I hand to the customer. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Yep.
If I could add something to that also, I think this is Eric Tice with Wipro. I agree with you, but I think a lot of the SLSA framework is mostly, a lot of it is process orientation, right? So having a number of components around, some of it would be standards around actually checking the third-party tools that you're using as well. Instead of pulling down binaries, pulling down code and actually doing scanning of that as part of your process as well, and reassuring them to some marginal degree of error, because while this is, I think this is a great project and I think there's a lot of benefits to it, it's not going to 100% guarantee everything, but it'll get you a lot closer. So I think it really becomes a discussion around documented governance, being able to show them, the checklist of everything that you've done, as a continued process, and what the SBOM outputs of scans and, how you're meeting the needs, at least of the SLSA framework and or whatever the SLAs you promise. your clients is really the only way you can go, but it's all about transparency, right? I mean, from that perspective, it's having strong governance and making that transparent to the end user.
Yeah, I think with this issue, it sounds like there's two related things here. One is the notion of like the transitive level, which right now we haven't really defined. There's been some discussion in the, if someone could add it to the notes, the verification summary that Tom Hennon started. I know there's a lot of discussion there. It seems kind of similar there because you could say like the distro provided this process, but one of its dependencies was this input, which itself has its own set of, has its own provenance and maybe its own SLSA level. And I think better defining that, like what was mentioned in the thread and at a previous meeting was like, when we say the source, do we make the chain all the way back to the upstream repo, or does it just go back to the distro's, I'll call it a fork for lack of a better word, although that's maybe not the best word for it, which pulls in some distro specific patches and the upstream, or does it go all the way back to upstream? Like what is the model? That's one thing if anyone wants to do that and submit a pull request, or I'm happy to talk about that if you want to bounce ideas off of. I think better defining that model would be good. To me, at least in my mind, either is okay as long as we define it. One other topic that I think is related, although I don't know if we want to get into that now, is source packages, because many Linux distributions, actually not just Linux distributions, language distributions as well, like Python and Go, you start with the actual source of truth is like a Git repo, and then you upload that to effectively like a tarball or a zip or something, and that's a source package, and then you build from that. And like, do we trace back just to the tarball, or do we go all the way back to the Git repo? The two are kind of a similar flavor, and so it might be worth kind of solving them in one go. Michael?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think you hit on the vast majority of my thoughts. Yeah. I think from like an end user perspective, the main thing I just want to know is like from a transparency sense, like what am I actually, like what are you actually attesting to? Are you attesting that I own this code? Are you attesting I just own this package? Are you attesting that I own the package plus the patches? And I know in certain companies are saying, hey, look, you hire us, we'll, our version, our fork of this thing, we are saying we will completely support all the source code, even the stuff we didn't write. So there's lots of different stuff there. And I think we just need to figure out a way to adequately and accurately communicate that information so that as an end user, when I'm pulling that down, and I pull down that SLSA attestation, I just might want to know, hey, what are you attesting to? Are you purely attesting to the fact that, yep, I ran the build? That's it. I'm not attesting to that, whether or not any of the actors who committed the code and whatever, I'm not attesting to whether or not they're trustworthy whatsoever, or that I know anything about them. I think just having that information is going to be, or having a way to communicate that information is going to be really valuable.
Yeah, I could be easily talked out of it, but I at least what was just said made sense to me. Because there's so many variants, if we can at least identify the options, capture that, and record this SLSA station covers, step A to step B, and clearly defining what step A and B are. The other option, I think from a user point of view, it would be easier if we could always say step A is always this and step B is always that. I don't know if we can actually accomplish that given so many variations on this, but at the very least, we should be able to make it clear what is in scope for a particular claim.
In terms of like concrete next steps, if anyone wants to volunteer, I think I have a pull request that I started and I plan on pushing. I didn't get to do in time before this meeting. That I worked with Joshua to better define the build model. He started a pull request and I also added to it. I think similarly, if we define the source model in terminology, we could. I think it's probably worth saying something of like, you build directly from a repo, or you build there's a Git repo, and then some sort of mirror or fork or whatever that adds in patches, and then you build from that, or you build that to a source package to that, and just define these terms so at least people understand, even without making a decision of what is or isn't canonical. At least we have that'll be a good step in the right direction.
You might be able to do this in like just a page or two of like a picture of, here are each of the steps, label each part. And, some parts may not apply to a particular circumstance, but, here's if you have every single plausible part and name each part, then, and then we can say, hey, this particular SLSA claim starts here, ends here. And then if it turns out everybody always only makes the same one, then we can be more, we can reduce the flexibility. But no matter what, even if we wanted to name a particular thing, we would first have to answer that question that Mark just raised, which is the terminology. So that sounds like a useful way to get forward, making that little diagram.
Sarah?
And in my mind, this conversation, those definitions, and then exactly what is happening in this piece kind of goes back to the beginning where we were talking about how does SLSA fit into the bigger picture. It helps really clearly define that scope and then what governance it does attest to, and then where are the other areas that would still need to be either identified as gaps or just discussed as part of that overall pipeline. I think this is very valuable. And if I can do anything to help, I would help out with this part as well too.
Yeah, again, it's in the notes. It's issue 235. So yeah. Okay, we're almost out of time. Any other topics before we go, or I guess we're actually basically out of time now.
Yeah.
Any last minute things?
Yeah,
David?
real quick. Who's going to start that diagram? Mark, were you planning to start that, or we need to find somebody?
I was not planning to do it. I have other things on my queue before then. So if anyone wants to, go right ahead. And if I ever get around to it, I will post something saying I'm starting it. I recommend anyone who's starting to work on it, maybe just post a note saying, hey, I'm starting to do this. That way others who want to reach out and collaborate can. That's probably a good process in general for any issue if you're going to spend significant time on it.
Okay, fair enough. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks all. Oh, and see you March 17th, and we'll send out an email about that.